Okay, so I want to work on showing how to use database projects and how to get a basic grasp on um, any framework. So I'm going to create a goofy little contact manager program. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new database. Go to data. And we're going to go to service-based database. We're going to call this contacts. Okay. So what I did was it created this. Now, one property that I really want you to pay attention to is this copy to output directory. I'll explain more about this later and show you the effect of it, but the point is, notice that it says copy always by default. That means that every single time that you run the program, it's going to copy the database over to the bin debug folder, which means every single time it's as if you ran the program for the first time. Now, if you have data in your initial database, then yeah, that data will be carried over. So, let's open up the database and go add a new table. And we're going to call the table contacts with a capital O. Okay. Let's rename this contact ID. Int would be the same thing as an integer in VB, and if I'm planning for a database which might have a lot of records, I might want higher IDs. So I'm going to do big int instead. It's the same thing as a long in VB. And I want to do an auto numbering feature, so I'm going to say identity. I'm going to do a first name field, and the n in nvarchar means that it's going to store Unicode characters. In VB, strings are Unicode, so for the most part, you want to do nchar and nvarchar. Then we have to give it a size and say how 30 characters would probably be good enough. The reason why I'm doing varchar in this one is names can go from Tom to Sally to really long names. So the idea here is I don't want to store 30 characters per record and have it store spaces for the rest of the field or for the rest of the values in the field. I want to sort of optimize the storage a little bit, and that's one way of doing that. Now, I'm going to require the first name field. I'm going to do the same thing with last name. And I'm going to say maybe 40 characters because you might have some really long last names. And again, we're going to require first name and last name. And let's say that they have a birth date. And we're going to call it a date. And again, everybody's born, so hey, not null. So when I click on update, it's going to analyze the changes that I made to the database and say, oh, here's what you did. You created this table. If I want to save the script that it would run to do this, I could click on generate script. And it would tell me where to save the file somewhere, and I could have that available. Right now, I just want to modify the database, so I'm going to say update database. Now let's add a contact so I can have some data to work with when I run the program. So if I expand tables, you'll see there's contacts and say show table data. Tom Jones. Let's say April 1st on 1987. And let's do Sally Smith. Let's do November 7th, 1964. Okay, so we just added a couple records to the database. It's automatically saved. Notice it's ID of 1, ID of 2. So we have some sample data to start with. Now, I want to be able to show the data. So I want to put on a data grid view. And I'm going to set the doc to parent. So fill this form. Now, like I said, I was going to use Entity Framework. So I need to add a Entity Framework model to the project. There's Entity Model. Let's call it contacts entities. Oops. Okay, so contacts entities. I'm going to say add. It's going to go through Wizard. Now these options let you change. Any framework lets you work in any framework in different ways. You can use a model, which is like a diagram of your structure. And what it uses is T4 templates to create your code files for you. And that's actually the option I'm going to use. I could start with an empty model, so I could design my model and go that way. I can start with a code first model, which would let me, instead of me creating a database like I just did here, I could have created my classes, and then I'd run some commands in the console, and it would update the database and turn that into a database structure. I could also reverse engineer a database and take the database and create a code first structure, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do from a model. Now, because I added that database, it has if you remember, I had the connections added to the Server Explorer, so that's the connection here, and if I had multiple connections in Server Explorer, it'd be listing all those connections. I could add a new connection there and get that all set up, but anyways. Do I want to save a connection settings in app.config as contacts entities? Yeah, so I'm going to say next. One thing I noticed is look at the connection string it'll create. Look at the location. It's going to store data directory, which is exactly what I want to use, and I'll explain what data directory is later on. I want Entity Framework 6. It's going to import the nugget packages that I need for Entity Framework 6. But what tables do I want to have? Now, the only table that exists in the database is contacts, so I'm going to add contacts. If I had other views and store procedures and things that I want to import, I would choose those items. And leave the model namespace alone. That's not really need, doesn't really need to change. And I click on finish. Okay. And as soon as this finishes, what it will do is it will pop up the Any Framework model. There you go. And it reverse engineered the database and created a model, and I have the contact ID, the first name, last name, and birth date. Notice birth date is of date. Notice that contact ID is of type long int64, which is the same thing as long. I'm going to click save just to make sure everything's saved. Now what it's doing is it's actually taking the T4 templates in the model and generating the code files. So if you look at the EDMX, you see that it has a T4 template right here. It's taking this template and running the T4 template process and creating different things. Now this is nothing, but if I look at the, notice it created a class called contact, and it has property contact ID as long, property first name as string. So it created these classes. Now, you don't want to modify this file, because as soon as you save the EDMX again, it will get erased because it's auto-generated. So don't mess with this file. I'll show you how to do that later in another segment. So what I'm going to do is create a data source from that contact class. So I'm going to go add. And I'm going to say contact. I'm going to say finish. Now, actually what happened was I was playing around with making sure this all worked and had a contact class already built. Notice it has email addresses and all that stuff. It's using what was already built. So what I'm going to do is Control-Shift-B and do a build. There we go. And look at that, the thing automatically updated for me. That was handy. Alright, so edit columns. And notice I have contact ID, first name, and last name. Where is birthday? Okay. So I have birthday. And let's move it down to the bottom. Contact ID should be read-only. Shouldn't be able to edit that field. Still want to show it. And heck, I could even just not show it. I could just remove the column. But for now, I'll leave it in. So let's go and delete what it did here. Set data source to, yep, that's fine. And go to data sources and remove contact. Rebuild. Data sources, let me remove. Yes, I want to remove that. Okay, there we go. And yeah, remove that. Okay. So let's try this again. Now, because I built, and I go to add project sources and go to object, you'll see contact. If I check contact, it'll add contact to the things. Yeah, let's edit the columns, get that cleared up. Birthday. And remove and add. And let's add from birth date here to make sure it's the right one. Okay. And so, like you can see, you can tweak the columns in the data grid view and make things read only and like content ID. We don't want that, and I gotta refresh it because I refreshed it. I gotta reset it to be read only. And you can change it to header text and say contact space ID or whatever. You can alter the way it looks. But now I have the fields that I want in the data grid. Now, if I run this program, it's not going to show anything. I didn't write the code to actually load the data. So let's stop now, and then what I'll do is I'll do another recording of that. I'm going to stop right for right now. Okay, so we set up the data, the database, set up the form to have the right user interface, and pointed that user interface to the data source, which we generated from the Any Framework model. What this data source does is acts like a abstract layer between your data and your data source and your actual controls. So what you can do is you can point your controls to your data source, and then you can just say the binding source's data source is this new data set or array or whatever, and it will repopulate. But you have an abstract layer, and you can you can have multiple controls. So you could say like, I could put text boxes in here and link them to the binding source so that they are um, gathering different values from different things. But for right now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do the code to make the program load the data into the data grid view. Remember, I created those two contacts earlier. So we're gonna go to the code. And we're gonna go to the load event. Really? Okay. And our class that we want to work with is the contact entities class. So we're going to create a context. There we go. And we'll actually create make it an instance by saying equals new. Okay. And then we're going to make it load the contacts. So what will happen is it will do a database query and create instances of the objects in memory. And all I gotta do is say db.contacts.load. .load. Now, when you do this, it will get every single record from the contacts table. If, for example, I wanted to only get the contacts that were born maybe 18 years and younger, for example, I could go .where, and this is using link. Any framework uses link a lot to do its thing. So I'm going to do a function. P is going to represent the current object, and we're going to say where the P dot birth date is greater than or equal to now dot add years minus 18. So what this is going to do is this is going to create a SQL, and it's going to create a where where query. It's going to say is the birth date greater than or equal to, and then figure out that date. Then I could say dot let's see. Oh, right. So there are things in the any framework that have extension methods, and I need to get the extension methods from from that namespace. So I'm going to import system.data.entity. Now, if I say dot, now I can call dot load. Okay, so what this where clause is going to do is it's going to filter and only retrieve certain records from the database. Now, for now, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to only do the whole. I'm going to load the whole table. But that's just one example of pulling those things. So load, and then we're going to set the contact binding source dot data source is going to be equal to the db.contacts dot local, and local is the in-memory storage list or whatever you want to call it. That's really like a hash table or hash list. But what we're doing is and heck, you can even look at local. Local is of type object model dot observable collection of contacts. So it's an observable collection. And then from that, we want to say dot, because again we imported system data and entity, we have an extension method called toBindingList. So this will allow it to do a binding list and have to know when records are modified and things like that. So we're done with writing the code. This will actually load the contacts. Now, just because I did some debugging, we're going to run this code, and I'm going to just make sure this is deleted. So there's no database in the bin debug folder, and I'm going to click run. If you remember, I added 2 contacts to the database, and it's here. Now, I didn't write any code to save changes, so I can monkey with the data here, close the program, and it's not going to save it. So I'm going to close the form. Now I'm going to go into the close code. So form closing. Okay. And I'm going to say when it closes, I'm going to say db.save changes. Now let's modify the records. Let's call Tom Jack. And let's add Jane Goodall. Actually, Jane Jane Jungle. There we go. And let's call it December 7th, 1986. So I have a new record, and I modified a record. And I'm going to close this. Now, I forgot to add a line of code, so I'm going to add that real quick. We want to end the oops. All right, let's name that. So, yeah, I didn't name that data grid. I meant to name that. Oops. Because I really hate data grid view 1. That's just horrible. Let's do data grid view contacts. Okay, so data grid view contacts dot end edit. So just in case in the data grid we're in the middle of editing the thing, we're going to force it to end the edit. Then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the binding source and do the same thing. So just in case we have other things going, but we're going to call end edit. So that way, just in case we're in the middle of editing, it applies those changes and gets that ready. Because you don't want to run into this problem. You want to have... Now, if hopefully you noticed the problem. Well, I did say the changes. The changes in the database happened, but remember that copy to output directory? That is what borked. So I'm going to modify this and say Jack. Now I'm in the middle of editing. I close the form. It calls end edit on the grid and then saves the changes. Now, if I run again, the changes did not save. Or actually it did save, but didn't go into the same database. If you notice, I have the design database right here. I also have a database right here. What happens when you debug a program or run it is it copies this database over to the bin debug folder. The connection string that it's using is data directory. By default, data directory is the same folder as where the program exists. Then it's going to go to context MDF. So when you're debugging, we're running the program in here, which means that it's going to use this database. So all the changes I make to it are actually in this database. But when I rerun it, what happens is, because of the property being set to copy always, every single time I run, I recopy. So every single time I'm running as if I've never run the program before, and it's fresh. I have never done any modifications in the application. So we want to change this to copy of newer. Now if I run and change, and notice Jack is there because notice it didn't recopy it over. And if I add Jane, Jungle, and 11.5/1976, and let's name Sally Sarah, and I capitalized the M there, so let's fix that. So I've made some modifications to the records, and if I went into memory and if I actually debugged the objects and looked at objects, I would see that it'd be Jack Jones and it'd be Sarah Smith with a lowercase m, and I'd have Jane Jungle as a new record. I'm gonna close the program. It went and saved the database. Rerun again. Make sure we had the same data. Yep. And see, it automatically updated the ID to be the ID from the database. So that's it, saving the data and loading the data. Okay, the last thing I want to cover is what if, obviously you probably want to modify the database and add some new things. And for right now, I'm not going to create another table, but you could and probably should, but I'm just going to modify that database. So I'm going to modify contacts. Let's see, what could we come up with? Let's call it okay, last contact date. Now, because of the fact that last contact date, they could never have been contacted. Someone else could have given us customer information. There was no contact. And also, we're modifying a database, so we need to have we either have to have a set a default value or allow nulls. I'm going to allow nulls. So we're going to say contact last contact date and date. And this time I'm going to say null and say comma. Yep. Okay. And I'm going to update the database. And say we're going to alter the contacts table. Now currently, our model doesn't have last contact date. All I do is go update model from database. And I can't add a table, but if you notice, refresh is going to reprocess the contacts table. So I'm going to say finish. And you see last contact date. Okay. Now, with dates, you kind of have an issue where it's a structure, you don't really have a null date. And so when it does load it in, it more likely what it'll do is it will load a date with the min date value. And we'll take a look at that in a second. But for right now, we're going to go to the form. And I want to, now, I just updated the model. And if you notice, if I go into the columns, and I say add, no last contact, I have to update the data source. The only time the data source right here gets updated. Oh, good lord. Okay. Yeah, I'll cut that part. Okay. So the data sources only get updated when you build. So when you build, it reanalyzes the object and goes, oh, I see you have new property. So when I build, okay. Okay, yeah, reload. Okay. And you'll notice last contact date is in the data source. So now when I go to edit columns and add column, last contact date. Wow. Okay. So contact ID, first name. Let's move last contact right here and say okay. So let's go and run the program. Now, when I run this program, it should pop up, and yep, I have no last contact date. If I go into Server Explorer and go to Contact Show Table Data, let's set last contact date to okay. Let's make it March 1st, 2016. Okay, so if I run this, why didn't it do March 1st? Well, I only modified the design database. So what I can do is close this. Hopefully I can delete this database. I might have to detach it first. Let's see. There we go. Now if I run it, it will copy the design database over to bin debug. And hey, look, there's March 1st. So it works both ways. I could copy the debug full database back over to design and get my changes that I made in the application. But here's last contact date, and there's March 1st in this, and then these are null. And that is how you get basic Entity Framework set up in using localdb in a project. Okay, so one of the things that I didn't cover was you should definitely have error handling in your code. You should be able to go through and know that you're not going to cause problems. I don't see where it ended it could possibly cause problems, but for right now, we're going to do a try. Now, catching EX as an exception that's going to catch every error under the sun. But if you look up on your website and you go MSDN, any framework, actually DB context, DB context dot save changes. And you have these exceptions that it can throw. So you go through here and go, okay, update exception, an error occurred sending update to the database. Update concurrency, database command did not affect the expected number of rows, and so on, so on, so on. So it's up to you to determine which ones. Probably DB update exception would probably be a good one to handle. So and I'll bet you it's gonna fuss about this, and I'll bet you I need to do an import. Yep. So I need to import that namespace to be able to catch that. There we go. And now I could write code to say what happens when a DB update exception happens versus any other exception. If any other exception happens, handle code here. Same thing here. Go away. Oops. As exception, there we go. And try. And we can do the same thing here and say now it helps to know what type I'm working on. So contacts is a DB set of contacts. So I want to know a DB set dot load. So I'm going to say MSDN DB set dot load. And they didn't document any of the extensions, so that's fine. But go to methods on the DB set and look up, see if we have it load. Aha, there's load. Yeah, we're not sending exceptions, so you might be able to find articles about that. But anyways, the idea here is if there were errors, you need to handle those and react to that, because otherwise your program's going to crash. But each program requires different error handling, so I'm not going to go into best cases or whatever, but the idea here is you need to surround your code with try catches, and if it fails, it will still react, and you can show a message box and say, hey, I couldn't load it, or whatever. I hope this has helped you get used to any framework and localdb. Please do not use access. Just don't. Good luck, and let me know if this helped.